All right, guys, so yesterday we talked about the differences between fiction and non-fiction texts and how they are two different genres, but they can also have things in common. So we read two stories yesterday. So we're going to fill out this Venn diagram together. Now remember, with a Venn diagram in the middle, we put things that are alike. Okay, and then on either side, we talk about their differences. So in the middle, we put things they have in common. On the outside circles, things that are different. So story one title. Now, both of these stories, since they were both about President's Day, they actually had the same title. So President's Day. Make sure that you put quotations around it because it's the title of a book. So we have President's Day and President's Day. But to tell the difference between them, underneath we're going to put fiction and non-fiction. Okay, so we have to think back to yesterday when we actually read the stories. So the first one we read was President's Day, and it was about that student in their class. Their class had that play that they put on where they were different presidents and talked about just the different presidents and what they did, and then at the end they had an election to choose the president, and the main character was chosen. And then the other one we read, President's Day, was on Epic. That's the one we read on together on Epic, and it talked about different things like who we celebrate on President's Day, when, how we celebrate. So that gave us a lot of information. So we can talk about how they were similar and how they were different. Let's start with how they were similar. Okay, how are these two texts similar? Well, probably the easiest one to write down. So you're writing this down with me on your paper. So both texts gave us information about President's Day. So even though they were fiction and nonfiction, they were different genres, both of them gave us information about President's Day. Okay, if you need more time to write, you can always pause the video. Okay, another thing, let's think about, was there one president that both texts mentioned? Let's think back through what we read. Did either of the texts, did they mention one president that was the same? I'll give you a hint. It was the first president. Okay, so the answer would be both texts mention George Washington, who was our first president. And he's the reason why we have President's Day. So both texts mentioned George Washington. So both texts mentioned George Washington. Whoop, there it is. Okay, so we've found two reasons that they are similar. Now let's talk about how they are different. So let's think about our fiction story. Remember we talked about some of the differences that made a text fiction or nonfiction. Okay, so let's think about something a fiction story has to have. Okay, they have to have characters. So this text had characters. Okay, because the nonfiction book did not. Okay, so this text had characters. Now let's think, remember the difference between nonfiction and fiction. So we noticed that the fiction text, so this text had, it's that fancy word for drawing. Starts with an I, illustrations. So this text had illustrations. It had drawings of the kids as they were dressing up as the presidents and while they were doing their play and in their classrooms. Now, the nonfiction book, it didn't have illustrations. What did it have? Nonfiction books typically, not always, but most of them use photographs. This text had photographs. We had photographs of different presidents. There were photographs of the White House. Those were actual photographs. Okay, so now let's think about what else a fiction story has to have. Okay, there's different parts of a fiction story. So we know that every fiction story, so this text had what comes first? Beginning, middle, and end. That's what makes it a fiction story. Okay, now let's think about something that the nonfiction book had that the fiction one didn't. Okay, now this is specific to nonfiction books. So our nonfiction book that we had on Epic had things like headings, had a glossary, an index. What are those called? So these are specific to nonfiction texts, so we can say this text had text features, like headings was one of them. A table of contents. Remember, you can pause it at any time if you need to get caught up. And a glossary. Okay, so that's what makes it different from a fiction book. The fiction book did not have text features. Okay, now let's really think about, so we talked about some of the things that make them different fiction and non-fiction wise, but let's think about the information they told us about President's Day. Let's think about which presidents both of the books mentioned, because they didn't mention the same ones. So if we think back to our fiction story, this text told us so the different presidents that the kids dressed up as. So this text told us about one of them was Teddy Roosevelt. He was a president. His full name is Theodore Roosevelt. So that was one of them. And another president that the kid dressed up as was Abraham Lincoln. So this text told us about Teddy Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln. Okay, but our nonfiction book mentioned different presidents. So we already know they both mentioned George Washington. Okay, and the nonfiction book actually mentioned two presidents that you don't hear about super often. So this text told us about, so the first president's name was Rutherford, kind of a strange name. Rutherford B. Hayes. He was the one that first signed President's Day into law, saying that it needed to be a national holiday. Richard Nixon moved them to Mondays. That's who we're going to mention next. And Richard Nixon. He was the one that made all national holidays on Mondays. So both of them were past presidents. All right, so take a second to finish writing. Then look at the awesome work we did here. So we talked about how fiction and nonfiction stories, even though they're different genres, they can still have things in common. Okay, but we also talked about how they have specific things that go along with their genre. So fiction stories will always have characters. Nonfiction stories sometimes will have things like text features. Okay, so you have to really look at the different things that make something fiction and nonfiction and decide for yourself. Okay, is this fiction or is this nonfiction? Okay, so very good job following along, guys. Make sure your name is at the top of this and you can go turn it in.